Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Leonard Lauder, co-founder and co-chairman of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Forgive me for being a minute or two late, but it's great seeing you. What's a pleasure is this. Every table is filled. Thank you for that. Thank you. So, for those who I haven't met, my name is Leonard Lauder, and I am the co-founder with my brother Ronald Lauder, who's sitting right over here, of the ADDF. We launched this in 1998, and we felt that we had something to say and something to do, because most of the money that was going into Alzheimer's was either care, which was desperately needed, yes, or the doctor or neurologist who took care of Aunt Sarah, and who said, because it happened to me, the doctor said he took care of my Aunt Reedy. Give me $1 million and I will cure Alzheimer's. So I believed him. He disappeared with my money. And that's where, and by the way, Aunt Reedy was Ronald's aunt also. And so we realized that there's more to be done than supporting one doctor in one hospital who took care of one's aunt. That this is a national or an international challenge which we decided that we would undertake to conquer. And I think we're en route. Now, you speak to people who are neurologists, they said, it'll never happen in my lifetime. Well, it'll happen in my lifetime, and I plan to live a long time. With what we are doing and how we're approaching it, it is remarkable what Dr. Howard Fillit, who I think many of you have met, has been able to accomplish. We will get there and win in our lifetime, because there is no choice for me except to see that it happens, and it will. We have a few honorees today who I want to quickly tell you about. We have Margaret and Daniel Loeb, he was the founder of Third Point Investments, and he's been a great, great supporter. And they have ensured that scientists around the world have the resources to do what we're doing. And I thank you for that. And we're also going to recognize a great visionary in Alzheimer's research, Dr. Richard Mohs. Did I get it right, Richard? Would you forgive me? By the way, I spend most of my life having people mispronounce my name. So that, for those of you who don't know, my name is Lauder, not Lauder. You've heard that before. Richard, we're in the same club. Okay. We have some wonderful sponsors who've helped us today. Third Point, Staples, Eli Lilly, and the Beacon Trust, as well as the Estee Lauder companies, all have pitched in. And I thank them. I thank my brother Ronald for what he's done. My bride Judy, who some of you may have met, that's her over there. We are 10 and a half months into our marriage. And all I can say is that people look at me, they say, oh, you look like you've had a facelift. So, Howard, I pledge to you the money I would have spent on a facelift to ADDF. And thank you, Judy, for my free facelift. We have other people we have to thank. I mentioned my brother Ronald and his wife Jo Carroll. and Liz and Randall Sandler, Nancy and Mel Goods, who are great, great supporters of us, Susan Lloyd, Helen and Bob Appel, and Julie and Phil Geyer. They have all helped to make this possible. Why am I thanking all of them? We have raised $1 million from this luncheon today. And the key thing is every penny of that is going directly to research. You are looking at the overhead. That's me. And my brother Ronald. We underwrite the overhead for ADDF so that 100% of all the money raised goes directly to supporting scientists, et cetera. By the way, we're a good investment for those of you who are interested. But we are going to make sure that in our lifetime and in your lifetime, it happens. Or you get your money back. I'll pass out. Now, it is my pleasure, however, to introduce my dear friend, old friend, fellow trustee, 8 times Emmy Award winner, former CNN and CBS anchor, Paula Zahn, who is going to join me up here. Paula, are you here? Now, Paula can say with certainty, she's so young and gorgeous, that if this will happen, certainly in her lifetime, too. Thank you.
Very kind of you. Thank you, Leonard. Leonard, I want to talk to you about that facelift you were just talking about. I thought if we used Estee Lauder products, we wouldn't ever have to defy gravity that way. Don't all you women in the room use that stuff that's supposed to lift you and fill all the holes in her face? It works, it works, it works. Well, it is my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. As some of you know, November is National Alzheimer's Disease Awareness Month, and when some of you walked in, you may have been handed either a metal purple ribbon or a cloth one, and I would appreciate your wearing it to show how deeply we support this cause that the Lauders have taken on. We have such enormous gratitude for what your family has done, and I think I speak for all of you in this room to say, consider all of us in this room your foot soldiers. So over the last several years, many people have come forward with their Alzheimer's diagnoses, raising awareness and trying to reduce the stigma associated with disease. And last year's honoree, B. Smith, an honorary board member of ADDF, Mel Goods, are among them. And to honor their bravery and show our support, I ask you all to continue to wear the ribbon throughout the month and to try to give as generously as you can, because what you give here today will have an enormous impact on drug discovery. You can also support the work of ADDF by participating in our door prize drawing. You may have seen some of the prizes outside as you entered the room. It's a great opportunity to help fund research this year, because for every donation you make, we have an anonymous donator who will be matching that gift. So every contribution is a chance to win a prize donated by our magnificent supporters. If you would like to be eligible to win, just pick up the donation envelope on your table, and we have left pens to make the process not very painful for you today. You will see them by your place settings. And this year's goal is $100,000, and that is in addition to the $1 million that Leonard said we have already raised at this year's luncheon. So staff will be around to collect those envelopes throughout our lunch. To give you an idea of where your donations go, your support will go directly to fund the development of new treatment for Alzheimer's, and soon, thanks to the efforts made possible by the ADDF and the leadership of the Lauder family, we will have treatments for Alzheimer's. Today, there are more clinical trials of Alzheimer's drugs than ever before. I look forward to hearing more about that after lunch from Dr. Fillit and Dr. Mohs. And they will talk in great detail about the potential these treatments offer. We certainly are all in need of hope. I know how deeply affected many of you in this room have been by Alzheimer's. My mother is 91. I have seen the disease slowly rob her of all the things she holds dear, her independence, her joy, her connection to her family. She has not recognized any of her children who she was so close to in many, many years. And I know many of you in this room have shared the same painful journey. I've heard probably 5 or 6 stories today of loved ones who've also suffered immeasurably. So we know that Alzheimer remains the only top 10 cause of death in this country that cannot be prevented, treated, or even slowed. Today, it affects 5.1 million Americans, but that number is going to grow rapidly. We know within the next few decades, it's estimated that some 28 million people will be affected by Alzheimer's. So the Lauders and the ADDF are leading the charge to discover and develop effective drugs to prevent that from becoming a reality. And as more philanthropists like Margaret and Daniel Loeb enter into the fight, the better our chances are of getting there. So I invite you to enjoy your entrees and your dessert, and we're going to be back after lunch to hear from Dr. Mohs and Dr. Fillit about some of the very promising advances that are being made in the fight against Alzheimer's. So enjoy your lovely lunch, and we'll be back for all of us to learn in about a half hour. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Leonard Lauder, Alice Schur, and Bonnie Pfeiffer Evans from the Charles Evans Foundation.
This is the nearest that I've ever seen to one big house party. So I've asked the management if they can serve tea at 4 p.m. for those who would like to stay here. Listen, we all have one thing in mind, that's to conquer this disease. So we are joined at the hip and in many other places. So I want to introduce Alice Schur and Bonnie Pfeiffer Evans, the honorary chairs of today's event. And they're both the trustees of the Charles Evans Foundation, and they have worked with us for how many years? About 12 years, 14 years. And they are incredible and gorgeous. So the Charles Evans Award recognizes those whose kind of contributions in the field of Alzheimer's have been exemplary. So I'm going to let the two of you do the presentation, if I may. Okay. So.
No, you're supposed to do it.
Am I supposed to do it? Okay.
Yeah. We were all prepared.
I thought I could have my dessert.
Not yet. You are.
Okay, so the award goes to Margaret and Daniel Loeb for what they've done. They've created the Loeb Center for Alzheimer's disease at Mount Sinai Hospital, and the president of the Mount Sinai Hospital is they're doing great things. They have a husband and wife team who are working on it. You promised me that your wife would get it done in the next few years. Yeah. Okay. He always keeps his promise. So thank you. It's the Ronald Loeb Cancer Center. It's a center for Alzheimer's disease at Mount Sinai. The center is dedicated to advancing diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of Alzheimer's. And so I think we all understand the importance of what the Loebs have done. You have done great things. I want to tell you this. It's a thrill to have you here. Where's Margaret? Margaret. Would you stand up, please? This is Margaret Loeb. I'm thrilled to have a new generation of leaders step in to help us on this magnificent journey. We will conquer Alzheimer's, and I know that with people like the two of you and the people in this room, we'll get it done. So I'd like to the pleasure to present the Charles Evans Award to Margaret and Daniel Loeb.
You have it behind.
Thank you. Thank you. Sure. I don't want to give your speech. I'll sound too articulate. So when Ron and Leonard asked me if I would be willing to accept this award, it was sort of like when Don Corleone asks you for a favor. You don't say no to Ronald and Leonard Lauder. They have been such incredible leaders in New York City, part of its fabric in every aspect of business leadership, philanthropy, the arts, science. I can go on and on. So it would be sort of unwise for me to say no to them. So there's really two types of people in this room. There are those who have personally been affected by Alzheimer's, either, God forbid, themselves or their families. And there are those for whom that will happen at some point in the future. There's nobody that will escape this disease. My own story relates to that of my father, Ron Loeb. He was a child of Jewish immigrants. He grew up in Compton. Through his intellect, he was able to get into UCLA, graduated near the top of his class, went on to Harvard Law School, where he was on the law review. He had an illustrious law career, served on boards of several companies. He had, at the time of his diagnosis, he'd had 6 grandchildren, 5 children, and 2 wives in succession, not at the same time. And he was just a remarkable man. There's a few of you in this room that knew him, and beyond his accomplishments, he was just such a warm and loving and compassionate person. John knew him well. That's actually how I met my first boss, was through my dad. It's always nice to have a little nepotism to get you a start in life. So, but this disease is like the Grim Reaper. It doesn't choose bad people. It doesn't distinguish. You could be brilliant and kind, and you're just as likely to get the disease as anyone else. But Paula Zahn talked about the 5.1 million people who have this disease. I had a conversation outside with Nancy Goods, and it reminded me there's also 5.1 million caregivers to those people and countless children. So if you look at the constellation around them, it really goes into the tens of millions of people today that are affected by this disease. But I don't want to underemphasize Nancy and the role of the caregiver. It really does upend their lives. I saw what happened to my stepmother, and just talking to Nancy, she does it with such grace, and it's really not easy. And they, along with the people who have the disease, really deserve our understanding of what they have to go through. There's also 2 other kinds of people. There are those who are participating in finding a cure, and there are those that are on the sidelines doing nothing. Obviously, everyone in this room today is doing something, and it takes a village here. It takes government research and NIH grants. It takes pharmaceutical companies. It takes entrepreneurs, and it takes groups like Mount Sinai who are using genetic tests to assess people who have high genetic likelihood and markers to get the disease, yet are not getting it, and using that data and that research to come up with therapeutics to help others who might get it. And it takes organizations like this. So with that, I just want to thank everybody who's here. Of course, the godfathers of philanthropy, the Lauder family.
Godmothers.
And godmothers. No, but But seriously, thank you all for being here. And I've already spoken for too long and not listened to my wife's advice, who I should also thank not only for her support on this, but telling me to get off as soon as I can. So thank you very much.
Paula. Let me reintroduce Paula Zahn. Just one word, if I can. We are doing things that no one really understands. We spread our net around the world. There was one example, I can't give you the full details, but there was a drug that Howard got interested in getting it through phase 2. It turned out that as a drug that was developed in Aberdeen, Scotland, and it was financed by a group in Singapore. And people I got into it, and it's now in phase 3. It would not have happened if we had just been focused on just one hospital, one city, one everything. We are a worldwide network, and thanks to Dr. Howard Fillit, he knows where everything is being done, and that's why I feel confident in promising you a cure in our lifetime. So let me reintroduce Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Once again, we wanted to thank the Loebs for their leadership in support of Alzheimer's research, and also, once again, wanted to acknowledge Alice Schur and Bonnie Pfeiffer for their enormous generosity, and the Charles Evans Foundation for making the award possible. Now it is my privilege to introduce you to Dr. Howard Fillit, a real giant in this area of research, and someone who has helped many of us on this dark journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Paula. I really want to thank everyone in the room tonight for being here and joining us in the fight to find new, safe, and effective drugs for Alzheimer's disease. We're very grateful to you for being here, and I know we've all been affected. This is a serious business, but we're going to get there, I promise. It's part of the business of what we're doing as a philanthropy is funding innovation. We're funding the high-risk, early-stage products that will hopefully eventually come to market. But ultimately, philanthropies like ours, and even early-stage investors, venture capitalists, biotechs, can't do it alone. When the cost of a drug to market is $2 billion, and phase 3 clinical trial, a single phase 3 clinical trial is $400 million, and you need somewhere between 2 and 4 of those successfully to get an FDA approval. The pharmaceutical industry plays a critical role in what we do. We cannot do it without them. And the people, it's the people in the pharmaceutical industry who make these things happen. Imagine if you were the woman who was in charge of clinical development at a place like Pfizer, and you had to make a $2 billion decision, and you had 2 children at home and a husband, and you had to decide whether or not your company should risk $2 billion on a drug for Alzheimer's disease that's disease-modifying, where we have no precedent for success, extremely high failure rate, and yet the market is unbelievable. It'll be the largest market ever, and the contribution to society will be enormous. And in our work, we work very closely with industry for all of those reasons, and we work very closely with the people who are in those industries. And about 6 months or a year ago, we realized that the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry are unsung heroes. Most of you, I'm sure, don't know the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry who spend their lifetimes trying to develop drugs. Judy Lewent, who was the chief financial officer at Merck, once said that 90% of the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry spend their entire careers never working on a drug that comes to market. Now, that's not to say it's frustrating, because the process of science is fascinating. It's creative, and it's incremental. We're always standing on the shoulders of other giants who came before us. And so we decided that we wanted to honor someone in the pharmaceutical industry who was carrying this torch through their lifetime and had made a major contribution that probably none of us here in the audience really know about. And that was a fairly easy choice for us to recognize Richard Mohs. I've known Richard since the early 1980s. He and I kind of entered the field at similar times in the late 70s, at a time when very little was known about Alzheimer's disease. Richard worked with Ken Davis, the president of Mount Sinai, who's gratefully here today, when they were at Stanford together, to develop the groundwork for what eventually became the first drugs approved by the FDA for Alzheimer's disease, drugs like Aricept and Razodine and Exelon. Richard had an academic career. They came to New York here at Mount Sinai. Together they worked. And Richard actually was the inventor of a cognitive instrument, a cognitive test called the ADDF, which is, in fact, the industry standard that all pharmaceutical companies basically use, and most of us who are running clinical trials use, to assess cognition. The sine qua non symptom and measure of Alzheimer's disease is how we measure memory and thinking and planning and judgment and language and the ability to write. And Richard invented the standard instrument that's used all over the world. It's been translated into numerous languages for how you do that. And it's been used to develop every drug that's ever been brought to market for Alzheimer's. About 13 years ago, Richard left his professorship at Mount Sinai to join industry, where he sat at the interface as vice president of clinical development for the interface between the preclinical research where the chemistry is done to create new drugs, new molecules, the testing of these in animals, which are very poorly predictive of what happens in humans because mice don't write books. And Richard was tasked with the job of deciding at Lilly which drugs would move from animal testing into human beings. A very, very important task. And he did that for many years. And today, Eli Lilly is conducting a clinical trial of solanezumab, which may be, in the next 12 to 18 months, maybe 18 months or so, the first disease-modifying drug for Alzheimer's disease to pass a phase 3 trial successfully and perhaps be approved by the FDA. And Richard was the one who was very involved in that decision and made that decision at Eli Lilly. So without further, I'm just so proud to introduce Richard Mohs to you. Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Howard, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. On behalf of my colleagues at Eli Lilly and Company, I'm very pleased to accept this first Industry Achievement Award from the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. Throughout the pharmaceutical industry, in companies large and small, there are literally hundreds of scientists working every day trying to develop better medicines for patients with neurodegenerative disease. I'm very grateful to Dr. Fillit, to the Lauder family, and to the Board of Governors of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation for their work for the recognition of the work of these industry scientists. As Howard mentioned, I started my work and saw my first patient with Alzheimer's disease while I was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, working with Ken Davis, who's here today and is now at Mount Sinai. We were looking at the effects of drugs that affected the cholinergic system. Subsequent to that, over those 40 years since then, I've had the privilege of knowing many patients with Alzheimer's disease and meeting many of their families. I've done lots of studies, and I've had the privilege of working with dozens, if not hundreds, of very talented colleagues. Also, as I look back on those years, what I see is First of all, that virtually all the patients I ever saw are now all dead, many of them dying after prolonged periods of cognitive decline and suffering with their families. We have introduced a few new treatments, but not nearly as many as we would like. And yet, if you look at the number of scientists who are working on Alzheimer's disease now in academia, in small biotech companies, and in large pharma, the number continues to grow every year. So I think it's worth asking what keeps those of us in the scientific community going. First is, it's the small but very important discoveries that we see emerging every day that give us a sound foundation for the development of future medicines and that provide what I would call very useful knowledge about this disease. Second, I think it's the thought that most of us have in the back of our minds is that if we do our jobs really well and we do the right studies and we accumulate the right set of knowledge, eventually we will be in a position where we can introduce medicines that make it less likely that so many people will have these prolonged periods of cognitive decline and suffering. And lastly, and just as important, is the constant and unwavering support that we researchers feel every day given to us by patients, their families, and patient advocates. Without the support of committed groups such as the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, research progress on Alzheimer's disease wouldn't happen. In addition to my colleagues that I've worked with throughout the years that I've been doing work on Alzheimer's disease, I want to thank my wife, Terry, and my daughter, Hillary, who have suffered through lots of ups and downs in my career and an inordinate amount of travel away from home that comes with being a scientist in the modern era. And the last thing I would like to leave you with is the message that the work of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation is very unique in that it provides much of the substrate that will provide for the beneficial development in the global development of new medicines for Alzheimer's disease. I'm most grateful to accept this award on the behalf of my colleagues, and I thank you very much. Okay, you the award.
My privilege to be able to sit down with two giants in Alzheimer's research. And I wanted to quickly recap some of the facts from the morning session for you. And that is to address the issue where exactly we are in Alzheimer's research. As we mentioned, we can diagnose it now, but we don't have a cure, and we don't even have a way to slow down the progression of the disease. In fact, it remains the only one of our nation's top 10 causes of death that can't be prevented, treated, or cured. So we have heard about the many sacrifices, Dr. Mohs, you've made in your career, and a very, very difficult profession. 99.6 of all Alzheimer's clinical trials are considered unsuccessful. Why is it so darn hard to unwind this horrible disease?
Well, the biology of Alzheimer's disease is very complicated and very difficult to understand. It's even more difficult to understand how we would develop a pharmacology around the biology that would move it in the right direction to have a beneficial therapeutic effect. I think back on Lilly's history in Alzheimer's disease research. Lilly set up its first preclinical laboratories in Alzheimer's disease back in 1986. And that was done in partnership with a small biotech company in California called Athena Neurosciences. It's a company that no longer exists. It was later bought by Elan Pharmaceuticals, and then that was bought by Johnson & Johnson. But as part of that collaboration, Lilly developed a cadre of scientists who eventually produced some molecules that we thought might move The amyloid biology, there's this underlying abnormality in amyloid that Howard has talked about in Alzheimer's disease, and we thought we had 2 clinical candidates that could be moved into patients to test this. This didn't happen until 2002. So it took
So wait, you're saying, I have to do some quick math, over 30 years you're talking about?
Well, it took from
Of all this
1986.
research, and it didn't produce one single drug.
Yeah, but I'd like to say, you mentioned unsuccessful, we have a 99.6% failure rate, but when Richard and I started in 1980, in fact, let me go back that when Bob Butler, my mentor, started the National Institute on Aging in 1976, the government spent, at the time when billions of dollars was being spent on heart disease and cancer research, we as a country spent $625,000 in 1976 on caregiver research and nothing on Alzheimer's research. So when Richard and I started in 1979, it was early days. And I ran a clinical trial in 1981 at Rockefeller. We didn't know how to run clinical trials. So when we talk about failed trials, there's a difference between an unsuccessful trial and a failed trial. A failed trial is one where it wasn't done right. And an unsuccessful trial just means that the compound didn't work. And I think we've learned how to do clinical trials. I talked about this morning. I think that science is incremental. We've learned how to do clinical trials now in Alzheimer's, and now we need the right molecule, and maybe it's solanezumab, but we've come a long, long way.
But how does it help the patient? And I don't want to sound like I'm discouraged, because we know how hard you're working at this. If on average, or at minimum, it takes 10 years to bring a drug through the pipeline, and we know in many cases the symptoms of Alzheimer's don't even appear 20 years after you develop the disease. So isn't the science always catching up?
A lot of times the science is catching up, and I think it's important for patients to know that while some of the current medicines might actually be modestly effective, in the long run it's going to continue to take active work to keep moving new good molecules through the pipeline. And just like in other chronic diseases, eventually we'll have treatments, some of which may slow the disease, but it's going to take a lot of different medicines moving through the system before we really make a major impact.
So you were, I think, very savvy to make the distinction between a failure and what is an unsuccessful clinical trial. Share with us some of the breakthroughs that have been made during these many decades-long processes.
Well, we certainly understand the biology of the disease, so it's really, we're in the translational phase. So cancer research started in the 1920s. Hypertension research started in the 1930s. So we've understood the biology, and drugs for hypertension were first discovered in the 1930s. So it took 20 years between the discovery that cholesterol was a risk factor for heart disease and the development of the first drug. And that was in 1955. And even though we have Lipitor on the market, the most successful drug in history, heart disease remains the leading killer. Now, I'm not trying to be negative, but we are on the cusp of developing disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's in our lifetime. For the first time in history, we will have drugs, disease-modifying drugs. And as I mentioned this morning, there'll be drugs that attack the inflammation in the brain that people suffer with Alzheimer's. There'll be drugs to protect brain cells from dying. There'll be drugs that attack some of the genetic risk that we have for Alzheimer's. There'll be drugs that remove these misfolded proteins like amyloid, which are currently the most advanced in the pipeline right now to slow down the disease. So for me, what's happening now is amazing.
Well, in a world where we know that some $600 million was spent on Alzheimer's research last year, and 8 times that much was spent on cancer, just to give you all perspective on the numbers, the participation of foundations such as ADDF are critical. Yes. Walk us through why those partnerships are so imperative.
Well, what big pharmaceutical companies are good at doing is putting their resources behind pharmacology drug candidates that have reached a certain level of maturity, so we think we understand them biologically, and they can move forward with these large late-phase clinical trials. No way that pharmaceutical companies can cover all the different biology that's emerging around the background for Alzheimer's disease. So just as when Lilly started out, we partnered with a small company, oftentimes big companies will hedge their bets by looking at what's going on in lots of little companies that are developing very specialized things. They'll look for that science to mature to the point where it'll be competitive with other projects within the big company and then move on. I just mentioned one other thing. In this business, you can't be afraid of failure. Failure of the compounds is part of the background, and companies are willing to risk that, but they have to be informative failures. You always have to know what to do better the next time, and if it's an informative failure, you can get the financial investment to take that risk.
You say you were very optimistic, that this is a very, very good time in research. Is there a single finding that you can point to that you're the proudest of, collectively, in research?
Well, I think that the development of the amyloid brain scan, which could, in the old days, we used to say the only way you can make a diagnosis is by a brain biopsy or an autopsy. Today, that's not true anymore. I mean, if somebody told me 20 years ago that I could write a prescription for somebody to get a brain scan and I could tell them, even before they had any symptoms, that they have Alzheimer's, and then be able to be sure, because as the Lilly trials showed us, and again, we learned from these clinical trials, and it was the Lilly trial of solanezumab that was done about 3 or 4 years ago that showed us for the first time that 35% of the people who were going into big pharma trials where we were risking $1 billion didn't have Alzheimer's disease. And so that revolutionized the world of clinical trials, and Biogen's study was the first study where everyone who went into the trial, 100% of people, actually had Alzheimer's. And when we're looking for incremental effects, that's a big deal when 35% of the study is noise or not even the right disease. So I think that's been the biggest breakthrough. It's going to enable us to do really good, rigorous clinical trials. So now when we tested anti-inflammatory drugs over the last 20, 30 years, I look back and think of all the anti-inflammatory trials we did and think, gee, probably none of them were done the right way, but today we can do them the right way. And we have more advanced biology, so we can develop better anti-inflammatory drugs that actually literally attack the inflammation that's in the brain.
ADDF has had a very good track record, thanks to your leadership, of supporting research on drugs that might have originally been used to treat different types of cancer, and now you're finding may have some impact on Alzheimer's patients. How important are these drugs that ADDF has also invested in?
Well, that's tremendously important. I mean, usually in a big pharmaceutical company, we're looking for an opportunity where it's already been brought forward enough so that we understand the nature of the molecule and it can be competitive with other things that we might be doing in cancer or diabetes or whatever. And we can't do all that internally. So we look to the little companies and projects that ADDF supports to provide the substrate for us to bring things forward. I mean, the Amyvid, the amyloid scans that Howard is talking about is a great example. That's an area of diagnostics that most major pharma would never have gone into, but through the funding with ADDF and some other places, people at the University of Pennsylvania, they set up a small company, they brought the technology along, and all of a sudden the lights went on. We realized this could actually help us. And we liked it so much, Lilly eventually bought the company. But that technology is now used in virtually all the big pharma trials around the world to help identify the right patients for these trials, as Howard mentioned.
And I think what you were talking about is repurposing, taking drugs that are already on the market, that we understand the biology of how the drugs work, the pharmacology, and repurposing them for Alzheimer's disease. And many drugs have been developed through the repurposing of their initial indication because drugs have widespread effects. These repurposed drugs, we know their safety profile, and it's not something that pharma is going to do, basically, because there are commercial issues with repurposing a drug from one indication to the other. And we don't have
It just might cut into their bottom line, Howard.
Well, I think it's more of an intellectual property issue because you can't, there are ways to develop intellectual property around repurposing, but it's much more effective, and I think there's a lot more novelty in new drugs than there is in repurposing. There are drugs that Big Pharma has supported for repurposing. But when we do these smaller clinical trials, if there's a big effect, number one, it's not 12 years and $2 billion. It's maybe 3 to 5 years and a few $1 million in the beginning or $10 million. So we can get to market, so to speak, much more quickly. And if they really work, there are ways that Big Pharma could pick this up and get an indication. And we need the arm of Big Pharma to make sure that these drugs are disseminated and sold and tested properly. So I think repurposing is a really important effort, and it's gaining a lot of traction all over the world now.
Now I'm going to ask both of you to make a house call. Is there anything any of us in this room and outside of this room can do that will help prevent us from developing Alzheimer's? Any lifestyle changes?
Well, I know it sounds trite, but again, a heart healthy lifestyle is good for your brain. That kind of just makes sense. But what we're trying to do is understand why. Why is exercise, if you think about it, good for your brain? Why? And so the answer is it's a lot more complicated than you think. It's not just blood flow. And what we've done through our research support is to try to define why exercise works, because as one of our board members, Ronald Lauder, once said, when we presented this to the board about how exercise prevented the shrinkage of the brain in old age, it stopped the slowing of memory and so on, he said, I want to know why this works. And so that's what we're doing. And with one of the companies we're supporting and created out of Stanford, we're looking at that molecule, BDNF, which is the most powerful neuroprotective molecule that we know about, which came out of research on why exercise prevents Alzheimer's disease. So when we're doing these kinds of heart-healthy things, Mediterranean diet, DHA, and all these other things, it's not just trite. There's very important science behind it. And there are also large clinical trials going on of lifestyle risk. If you think about it, you can't just isolate exercise when somebody's eating food every day. So you have to bring these together into a very complicated clinical trial to actually get an answer. And our field is doing that too.
Can you give us a final thought as we all leave here, exactly
Sure.
where we are on
Look,
the cusp of a cure?
Yeah, I just add to Howard, you know, the brain is very plastic and you should exercise it because it'll develop new connections. That's how we learn, and it'll happen throughout life. Success in drug development is mostly a function of a high throughput of lots of molecules through the system. And there's no one company or no one institution that can make that happen. We need an ecosystem that rewards new ideas and the conduct of informative studies and the sharing of information throughout the system so that the whole ecosystem pushes molecules through as fast as possible and learns as much as we can about each one.
And aren't our great supporters here today a critical part of that ecosystem?
Yes.
Well, if anybody's going to get us there, it's to these two gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and thank all of you. I will just, look, not part of my remarks, but Howard underwrote a study some 15 years ago where we took two groups of people, same age, same everything. One group walked, was it 30 or 40 minutes a day, vigorously, Monday through Thursday or Friday. They gave Saturday and Sunday off. The other group did their normal life. Before they started, they did an MRI of the brains of both groups. After 6 months, they did an MRI also of the brain. The people who had done the vigorous walking had more brain cells, and the brains expanded. The people who only lifted weights and yelled at their wives had shrinking brain cells. So we will see you in Central Park tomorrow morning. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Paula Zahn, and thank Howard Fillit, and thank all of you for your support. Thanks.